Ready for me? Okay, good. Hi, welcome to the Richardson Plano Networking Group Friday Lunch and Learn. Today our guest speaker is Shawn Johnson. She's a speaker and trainer whose passion is working with emerging leaders from younger generations. She uses her many years of experience teaching and coaching millennials to bring understanding to a multi-generational workplace. She has proven strategies that equip business leaders to design a work environment that blends the best of each generation. Her philosophy is happy people, happy company. Shawn's a member of the John Maxwell team and recipient of the John Maxwell International Certification Scholarship. She's also a certified DISC behavioral analysis consultant and has completed courses in positive psychology. Our speaking combines real-life stories with factual data and proven solutions to establish a high-functioning workplace culture. Shawn has a Bachelor of Science in Marketing from the University of Nebraska. She's married to Ronnie Johnson, and they have two grown millennial children, Kiefer and Chloe. Shawn's childhood home is South Dakota, and she loves a state she loves during the months of May through September, and I think you can probably figure out why. She's not a native Texan, but claims that she got here as quickly as she could. Please welcome Shawn Johnson.
Well, thank you, Randy. And now I'm going to show my age by putting my reading glasses on. So you'll get the perspective about the multi-generational workplace from my point of view, the parent of millennials and a baby boomer. And it's my passion to help bring understanding, because when we all work together, life is so much better, right? So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to encourage all of you to go ahead and participate by putting comments in the chat, if you will, when you think something's interesting that I'm saying. And go ahead and, no, this doesn't want to work. There we go. And go ahead and tell me if you identify with certain generations more than others too, or if you don't identify at all. Because sometimes when I talk to people, they're like, well, I don't really identify with any generation. And that's just fine. I understand that. That's the way life is. So have you ever had a time when you were talking to someone from a different generation, older or younger, and you felt like you just weren't connecting? You could see their eyes were glazing over, or if you're on the phone or nowadays on a Zoom call, you can tell they're completely disengaged and they don't know what you're talking about. Well, about 6 or 7 years ago, probably, I was talking to a group of millennials, my kids included, and I was telling them a story about an old car that I had in college. And I was telling them that I always had car trouble with this. It was a Chevette, if some of you remember Chevettes. And it broke down one time when I was in rural Nebraska. I grew up in South Dakota, but I went to college in Nebraska. And it was on this, state highway. There was no traffic to speak of. There were no farms nearby. And I had to walk quite a ways to a filling station and then use a payphone to call and get some help. I think I ended up getting a tow truck. And they're all just looking at me totally dismayed and confused. And I said, what? And one of them said, well, what was wrong with your cell phone? Did you not bring your charger? They couldn't relate at all to my problem, because if they had the same problem today, they would have solved it with a cell phone or a bunch of different ways. So I think when we understand generational differences, we communicate so much more effectively, because it occurs to us right away. While we can tell and share that story, they're not going to have a context to put that in their lifetime. So we'll talk today about how we can communicate to connect across generations. And then a little bit later in my presentation, I'll talk to you about finding a common language that's non-generational that we can use with everybody. And that's so important, because sometimes generational stereotypes get in the way of us really connecting with people. So let's start by talking about generational perspectives, because generational differences influence so much of our life. The way we communicate, the way we interact in the business world, the way we shop and make purchases. And I think most of us here on this call are somewhat small business owners, or we would call ourselves completely small business owners. So our customers would hopefully range in age, and we want to be able to connect to all of them, right? So we want to do business in a way that's good for everyone. There are three defining experiences that matter in defining generations. And the biggest one is parenting style, the way we're parented. Each generation's a little bit different. Technology. Technology is important not only because of what it's doing in our world today, but our decisions are also influenced by the point in time when we were introduced to technology. An example of that would be that I was introduced to email in the 80s when it first became available. Traditionalists were also influenced to it at that time, but they were older, so it's a different point in their life cycle. And then younger generations don't even know life without email, but they don't really think it's important. They think of it as old technology. So all of that influences the way we communicate. Formative life experiences are very important. I think we can all think of times in our life when something happened that really changed our world. For boomers, the 1960s were huge, right? You know, you had the assassination of JFK, you had the civil rights movement. There were just so many things, first man on the moon, so many things that happened that changed our worldview completely. And now we have COVID, and that's going to change the worldview for all of us, but especially for Gen Z. That's going to completely change the way they look at life. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Well, let me remind us all that everyone is unique. So if you're listening to this and you're saying, man, I don't feel like I identify with anyone in my age group or whatever, that's okay. We're all unique, and there are a lot of things that go into making up our worldview and our perspective. So if you have comments about that, please share them in the chat. I love to hear what other people think and what their experiences are. And as I said, which generation do you identify with? You know, if you feel inclined, share it in the chat. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Well, why does it matter? Sometimes people say to me, why do generational differences matter? I don't really think it's that big a deal, but it really is, because organizations, for example, if they want to attract and retain and engage the best people, they need to learn to understand that sometimes millennials look at work a little bit differently, but we don't want to lose them because they're the leaders of tomorrow. They are now 50% of the workplace. Gen Z's coming into the workplace. They are now 10%. They're very important to our workplace and our world and the future of our world. So we want to seek to understand each other. We want to help them understand us, and we want to understand them. Understanding generational differences also equips us in our own businesses to connect with the people we need to, with vendors, with customers, with work associates. And it prepares us to embrace those differences and use them in really productive ways. So let's talk about traditionalists. My mom is a traditionalist, so I always kind of think of her when I talk about this. And many of them are still working. I think that's a great thing. My aunt, who's 76, is a full-time school psychologist, no real plans to retire. My uncle from a different marriage, he still runs a steel company along with his son. So traditionalists are really a vital part of our world, and they bring with them so much perspective that we can all benefit from. And it's great when younger generations can learn from older generations. You know, they grew up with an authoritarian style of leadership or parenting. And a big reason for that is because when they were growing up, you know, World War II, World War I was just a ways, you know, before that. There were so many people in the military. Every family usually had a connection to the military. They either knew someone or they had a family member. That's just not true today. They estimate that Gen Z and even the millennials, only 3% of them personally know someone in the military. So that's changed the way we parent, the way we view authority. And traditionalists still have in their subconscious that respect for authority, and they also have a different idea about communication. They grew up with rotary dial telephones, paper communication, remember that, letters? And even telegraphs or telegrams. So sometimes when I talk to a traditionalist, someone, you know, like my mom or her friends, they still think there's a long distance charge to make a phone call. So we have to keep all this in mind. It'll help us understand them, when we're interacting with them. And perhaps some of you identify with the traditionalist generation. And there's so much to be gained by those relationships and friendships. Baby boomers. Well, baby boomers, of course, we all know, we've heard for years, it's a really big generation. So the gap between start to finish is really big. And you've got older boomers and you've got younger boomers, but they all kind of have some ways that they think alike. And I consider myself to be on the younger side of boomers, but I very much identify with this generation. So we grew up with our parents as the authority. How many of you had parents that said, do it because I told you to? Yeah, I think some of us, we had parents that did that. So that's the way we grew up, unlike younger generations who often grew up where parents said, what do you think? Let's talk about it. Why do you think this is? That was not the way most of us grew up. Communication and technology included a rotary dial phone, then a touch tone phone. And when the phone rang, what did you do? You ran to answer it, right? Because if you didn't, you'd have no idea who called, unless they called you later and told you. You learned to answer the home phone, most of us. Johnson residence, this is Shawn speaking. So the phone call was a very important way of communicating for us. Some of us even remember party lines. That was a crazy thing. But we were introduced to email and faxing mid-career. So sometimes where we think of those things, especially email, as current technology, younger generations think of it as cumbersome and antiquated. So just a little perspective there. And of course, like I mentioned before, we were impacted by so many things: the Cold War, Vietnam, civil rights. The interesting thing about boomers versus younger generations, I learned this really became apparent to me working with millennials, is that boomers are kind of workaholics. That's where the term came from, is the boomer generation. We like to work. We like FaceTime. We like to be present in the office or in the meeting or in whatever it is. We know that we can work virtually. We know that we can work remotely. But as a generation, we tend to think of work as something important. The longer the hours, the more you're getting done. We value all that, and we enjoy teamwork. That's why I included this picture, teamwork. They're kind of young, but they've got the teamwork attitude. Gen X. Okay, how many of you are familiar with Gen X? Anybody here identify yourself with Gen X? Gen X kind of gets lost because it's such a smaller generation between millennials and boomers. But things changed for Gen X from the baby boomer children. The divorce rates went up. So oftentimes they were raised in homes where there was only one parent at home. That's why they became known as the latchkey kids, because they would have to let themselves into the home with their key and come home alone. And whereas the boomers might have mom making Toll House cookies or peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, hanging out in the kitchen, Gen X had to make their own snacks, use the microwave. So they became very independent. They grew up with a little more technology than boomers. Oftentimes they might have grown up with a personal computer. They had more video games. For boomers, really, if you thought about a video game, it might have been Pac-Man or something. There wasn't that much available. Xers were influenced by things like the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Challenger disaster. I never realized until recently what a big deal that was, interacting with some people from Gen X that said that really shook their faith in whether or not things were going to end well. So I thought that was really interesting. They are very skeptical. They're very conservative as a group, not all of them. They're loyal to their profession more than their company because they saw their parents struggle and lose jobs that they had worked really hard to get. So the shift from boomers to Gen X is really big in the workplace, because where boomers oftentimes thought, I'm hoping I'm going to be with this company for a long time, Gen X doesn't think that way. And that becomes even more apparent as we move into the millennial generation, where you're not going to be loyal to one organization. Pension funds are a thing of the past. So let's talk about millennials or Gen Y. I know some of us, maybe quite a few of us, have children in this category, so we have our own frame of reference. Millennials are Gen Y, but they became called millennials because so many of them came of age right at the turn of the millennium. Millennials are known for having helicopter parents, right? Those parents that are hovering over them, get bad names. Some parents take it too far. They actually call the boss for their grown child. But we're helicopter parents, some of us, and the reason is, I believe, one of the biggest reasons is safety. The Amber Alert and before that, the milk carton kids made us all very aware that bad things could happen to your children. And so gone are the days when you let the kids out the back door and you say, just ride your bike wherever you want to go and do your thing. You know, we know as raising millennials that oftentimes we had to be more careful, especially for the younger millennials, because that was a real threat. So millennials grew up with video games being a very dominant part of their world. And there are a lot of reasons for that. New technology, kids are safe when they're at home playing video games, but that really affects the way they look at the world of work and the way they look at life. And when I first started talking about this, even my son, I think, was a little taken aback. He was like, well, it's not that big a part of my world. And I said, well, okay, but do you find yourself thinking you should get to the next level in whatever you're doing? And he said, yeah. And then the more he thought about it, the more he said, and I think every company should have like a beat the boss competition. So video games definitely affect this generation. And another part of video gaming was always that if you weren't doing well at the video game, you just quit and you put in Mario Tennis or something. And so all of those subconscious habits come with this generation. When we understand that, we can communicate better. We can create opportunities for them that make sense to them if we want to keep them working with us. So the work attitude of the millennials is they work with organizations. They don't really view it as I'm coming to work for you. They view it as I'm coming to work with you. They know they can work from anywhere, so they don't value FaceTime the way boomers and even some Xers do. So when we talk to them about work, sometimes we think they're lazy or entitled, and that may not always be the case. It may just be that they know they can work from anywhere, a coffee shop. The world events that have affected them, of course, we all know these, you know, the rise of global terrorism, 9/11, reality TV, social media. Their world really, this time period really saw some huge shifts in the way we think about our life in general. Gen Z, how many of you know very much about Gen Z? Raise your hand if you feel like you know. David raised his hand. Gen Z, this is a really interesting generation, and people tend to lump them in with millennials, but they're very, very different. You know, they're going to be 5 to 23, 5 to 24. And I taught a class of Gen Z, a senior leadership class in nursing last week. I'm kind of doing some guest teaching at the university level because it really helps me identify with what's going on for them. Some of their education is really great. Like I never had leadership classes when I was in college. And these are nursing students, and they're really being equipped with some great tools to take them into the world of healthcare. But where they're struggling is in soft skills because they didn't grow up with a home phone usually. So some things that we just take for granted that they're going to know to do, like put a signature on their email, they just don't know. And you don't know what you don't know. So we have to help them. And that's where, you know, the emerging leader thing that so many of us are passionate about becomes a big deal because we can help them. They're really bright. They're the future of tomorrow. We can help them become even better at doing what they need to do to make their difference in the world. They're very technology reliant. They've never known a world really without a smartphone. And they consider Google to be the authority. So unlike older generations who maybe thought the boss was the authority or whatever, they oftentimes will say, oh, well, let me just Google that. And that's their authority. So they're very conservative too, I might add that. Compared to millennials, Gen Z is very conservative. They tend to be the children of Gen X, another conservative generation, and they've kind of followed their parents' example. They don't just love being on a lot of social media, which is very different than the millennials. They're very guarded. Well, are there questions or comments? I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. Open up your mic or maybe
Yeah, so
Dave
just
has
open up your mic if you have a question for Shawn or a comment or whatever. I'll call on you as soon as I see your mic open, Vic.
It was enlightening because I've always heard the terminology of Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials. I'd never heard of the generation called traditionalists. And so I just wanted to say thank you because it was enlightening to have a point of reference for what age group qualifies as what generation.
Yeah.
Great.
And it gives me a completely different insight because my mother-in-law, she's a traditionalist. She's 83 years old.
Yeah.
And she's got dementia and Alzheimer's, and we're her caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
And so from the perspective of your presentation, it gave me a different perspective to understand and further develop my communication skills towards her. So thank you for that.
That's great. Yeah.
Randy?
Shawn, thank you for that. I was aware of much of that, not all of it. In your experience, now you may get to this later in the presentation, but in your experience, are you finding companies, A, becoming more aware of the differences, more conscious of it, and B, finding ways to leverage those differences, support those differences, et cetera?
It really varies by company. I kind of backed into this topic in many ways, and one of them was that I kept hearing people complain, everything from recruiter, headhunter people that I know through other channels to business owners, you name it, especially complaining about millennials. And the interesting thing was that very often these people were boomers, which were theoretically the parents of the millennials, you know. And I realized that because I'd spent so much time around the millennial generation, not just my children, but in teaching and doing leadership classes, I realized that there was this big disconnect. And that when you understand millennials, even though, I mean, every generation has people that just aren't as motivated. I mean, they're just not, you know, every generation has differences, but millennials overall just have a different point of view. And so I became very passionate about helping department managers, HR people, business owners, and I am very passionate about helping them understand millennials because they just bring with them so many great talents and strengths that we need. But we have to understand, especially corporate America, they don't just love getting moved around the country like corporate America likes to do. They, as a generation, not all of them, but as a generation, they don't love that, and they'll quit the job if they have a bad boss. You know, whereas some of the rest of us, we would put up with it, right? How many of you put up with a bad boss before? You know, and I find in talking to especially millennials, they're like, nope, I'm out of here. So if you think of managers and leaders as being the same thing, they're not. And that may cause you to lose some of your best millennial people because a manager that's just managing and pushing people forward without really leading them, they're not going to respond to that very well.
Shawn, as a John Maxwell coach, is the DISC personality predominant in any one of these groups, or is it like the rest of the world spread across everybody? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I'm going to talk about that next. So you read my mind.
Good
But
tee
yeah,
up.
huh?
That's a good tee up, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good tee up. So no, the DISC is every generation is going to be a D, an I, a S, or a C. So it's a great way to eliminate those generational differences when we're trying to communicate without using stereotypes or being confrontational. So great question. I like that one. Anybody else? Are we ready to move on?
Let's keep moving.
Let's keep moving because we're going to run out of time, right? See if I can find my presentation. Here we go. All right. Whoops. Hold on just a second. I did something really crazy here. I don't know what I did. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. So when we understand generational differences, just to kind of reiterate, we can better communicate and collaborate. And I think we all agree on that just from the comments, because there's so many ways that we are the same. We're not just always different. And this is a great quote that I found from a company that does generational marketing about how all of these things, when we connect and understand them, it helps us to engage and sell to our customers. And since all of us, I think, in this world are trying to connect with others, it seems really important that we understand other people to the best of our ability. So let's talk about marketing, and then we'll move into the DISC discussion that we just talked about. But since most of you are doing some kind of, I mean, we're all trying to influence or sell or help or connect, right? That's what we all do. Whether it's selling jewelry like Patricia, or whether it's doing leadership classes or consulting with small businesses, we're all trying to influence other people in a positive way. So when we market to traditionalists, who are also called the silent generation, because they grew up believing that it was better to be seen and not heard, some of this is life cycle related, like the fact that they're spending less on clothing and transportation. I mean, that just makes sense, right? But traditionalists are also very conservative, as we know. They're selective in their spending, and they like to say and like to think, and usually are great at managing their finances. They were probably, as a generation, more prepared for retirement than, say, boomers. Marketing to baby boomers, this is a big deal because it's still a big generation and they're active spenders, and many of them have money to spend. They enjoy better brands because, of course, our generation grew up watching all those TV commercials. Madison Avenue was in its golden age. Boomers tend to thrive on prosperity and achieving personal goals. So that's going to be a big focus for them when they're trying to decide where to put their resources. We as boomers, we love to be VIP, right? We like recognition. We like to be part of the VIP program, whatever that is. And we value making an impact. Another important thing about boomers that sometimes marketers overlook is that 77% of boomers have no children at home. So that means we can direct our resources, whether it's time or money or whatever it is, to other things, which I think most of us are doing. Marketing to Gen X. I find the biggest part to remember about Gen X is that they're always looking for work-life balance as a generation. And they're frequently overlooked because they're a little smaller, but they are at the height of their careers and income. So they are making money and they are buying things. They like to contribute to worthwhile causes. Another interesting thing about Gen X is during this time of COVID, studies have shown that Gen X has been the least affected financially by the pandemic. So that's an interesting factor. They and millennials, especially older millennials, have been the least impacted financially. Whereas 20% of boomers are saying they're going to have to work longer because of the pandemic. They can't afford to retire. Either they were furloughed or they had some issues with investments. That's not really happening to Gen X and to millennials. So they're kind of rocking along as a group. Now, I know some of them have been drastically affected, so I don't mean to downplay that. Another thing about Gen X that plays into the way they look at spending money or spending time, spending resources, is that 46% of them still have kids under 18, but they're also caring for aging parents. And for some reason, those numbers are higher with this generation than with previous generations, where they're having to juggle the kids and the aging parents. So once again, it's a balance issue. Marketing to millennials. Sometimes we don't think about this, but millennials really value trust. So if we tell them this product is going to do X, or you're going to experience these results, and then they don't happen, they're very disillusioned with that, more maybe than other generations. They really rely on their peer reviews, transparency, and trust to make decisions. And of course, those of us who have millennials know that they love convenience, right? If they see something on their phone that they want and they can afford it, they'll just buy it. So that's much different maybe than some of the older generations who might be skeptical. They spend money on experiences. So we went on vacation with our two millennial kids a couple of weeks back. We went to Colorado. We did some hiking, we did a lot of eating, hanging out, stuff like that. But one thing I always notice when I'm with that generation is that they're very much into the experience. What are we going to eat? Where are we going to hike? And then my husband and I are like, did we bring the right equipment? do we need to buy something else? You know, so there's a big difference there in the way we look at what we enjoy. And younger generations, both millennials and Gen Z, are very much into the experience. They will spend money on experience before a thing, you know, an item. And of course, they have a smartphone. So keep that in mind. Marketing to Gen Z, something that's often overlooked is that these younger generations love video marketing. I find my nieces, I spend a lot of time with them, and they're in high school and they're Gen Z, and they watch a video on everything. If you ask them a question, they're like, oh, well, let's just pull up YouTube and check it out. They're very much into video. They cook by video. You know, you say, do you want to make this? Oh yeah, we'll just pull it up on YouTube. They'll show us how we make it. You know, these are kids who aren't going to have a cookbook, for example, and they really care about their health overall as a generation. Of course, they like tech. They like experiences. They're very diverse. So our world has gotten to a point where when we do those surveys and you check the box, what your ethnicity is, Gen Z is going to have a hard time relating to that, and the generations after them. They don't think like that. It's a very diverse ethnicity, you know, related generation. And a big factor that sometimes is overlooked is that Gen Z is huge. They have a lot of buying power. So 86 million Gen Zers out there. And this study is about a year old, so there's more now probably, but Gen Z is a really big generation. And we think that it's going to be cut off now with COVID, that anyone 5 and under is going to be part of the next generation because COVID is such a big factor. So Gen Z has been so dramatically affected by COVID that we think it's going to be, you know, 5 and up will be considered Gen Z now. And then 5 and under, there's some debate about what they're going to be called. But Gen Z, important generation, young leaders, definitely going to make an impact on the world. So marketing strategies, let's say you've got a business and you want to try to, you know, influence or market or connect with every generation. Well, one thing you can do is keep your marketing diverse. You know, don't pigeonhole it unless you really need to. Another thing is that every generation, statistics show, is shopping online. So something we forget sometimes. And whatever you do, don't make generalizations, because here's what's happened is where previous generations maybe didn't, like my mom, who's a traditionalist, and we might not buy the same thing, but younger generations, boomers and millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Zs, very oftentimes they all will buy the same thing, or they'll all want the same concert tickets. So it's good to appeal across the generations. Every generation uses Facebook. How many use Facebook? That's what the statistics show. Every generation uses Facebook. So, and don't we all have Facebook pages and business pages? More than 75% of all generations want to see a product in a store. That really surprised me, and that's a very new study done by this Alliance data. So that's interesting, because we kind of think the internet's taking over the world, right? 1/3 of all consumers say the total in-store experience is important. And of course, we all know that we want payment security and fast checkout and all of that kind of thing. But I thought those statistics were really interesting. So communication is key. We all know that. And we talked about this a little bit a few minutes earlier, that we want to be able to communicate across generations. So we know it's important to find ways to communicate that don't use stereotypes and don't make generalities. We want to be able to communicate effectively and non-offensively. Because there are three things, there are things that we all want, and one of those is clear, inclusive communication. I mean, here we have an older couple probably buying jewelry from maybe even a Gen Z, and they're going to want to be able to trust her, and they're going to want to be communicated with clearly so they know exactly what their purchasing options are. What's the quality of the piece that they're looking at buying? Another thing that sometimes we forget about communication, and I've been so guilty of this, is that it's always about the other person. How many times do we become maybe a little disgruntled or frustrated and think, well, I sent them the email, I sent them the text, I left a phone message for them and they're not responding. And we forget that communication is always about the other person. So in today's world, what I think that means is that we have to adjust our communication to reach the people that we want to reach. You know, if they aren't answering emails, send them a text. If they don't respond to phone calls, send them a text. Talk to them on Facebook Messenger. But always think about the person we're communicating with. And one way we can do that is to speak our customers' language, or speak our family's language, or our friends' language. Because when we look at the DISC, which we talked about earlier, and similar other behavioral style things, we find that everybody has a way they prefer to be communicated with. When we can identify that, it makes it so much easier to connect with it. And things like the DISC are not generational specific. So, for example, my daughter and I are both high I's, and she's a millennial and I'm, a boomer. So you can be any generation and be any one of these four things. It's non-generational. And that's something that always comes up when I do DISC workshops. People love that because we can have a DISC workshop with people from every generation and still be talking about the same thing and understanding it in the same way. So use the DISC to build relationships. And here are two main things that you can focus on if you decide to use DISC to build relationships. You can learn what causes the other person comfort and happiness, makes them feel good, makes them feel like you care. And you can also learn what their biggest fear is so that you don't use that and trigger some kind of negative response. And of course, it's great for building relationships and teams. So learning to identify DISC styles. How many of you are familiar with DISC styles? I can't see everybody, but hopefully some of you are. So I'll kind of give you a little brief overview for those who aren't familiar. The D, or the dominant quadrant, is going to be that person that's fast-paced, they're task-oriented, they're an extrovert, they make decisions quickly, even if they're the wrong ones, and they're always moving forward. They're not necessarily focused on people. So when you talk to the D, you have to be direct and to the point. If you start talking too slow, you're going to lose them. Sometimes people think of these, they'll say they're natural born leaders. No, they're just really quick decision makers. And I can say all this because I'm a D. And I understand that I'm always impatient. I'm always moving forward. These are the people looking at their watch. There's they say only 3% of the population are dominant. But when you see them and you interact with them, you'll know who they are. The I is the influencers. They like to have fun. They want to ask you about your family. They're going to want to tell you their stories. So when you're interacting with them, they're going to want to talk and give you all this input. They're not going to want to hear about details, though, and they're going to want to feel appreciated. Their greatest fear is being rejected. So keep that in mind. The D's greatest fear is being misled. The S's, the largest percentage of the population are S's. And S's are great people because they're very people-focused, they're very stable, they're very steady, they're not as extroverted, they don't talk as much. They keep everything running. But what they really don't like is destabilization. So if you're trying to talk to them about making a major change, even if it's just in their insurance, they might push back. They're resistant to change. And you have to be trustworthy with them because they really don't like loss of security or having to distrust someone. The C style. The C style, these are the analytical people. So when you're interacting with them, they might ask you 10 questions right out of the gate. And you're like, what? But that's just how they are. They want data, they want facts, they're task-oriented, and they're going to ask a lot of questions. And so don't be impatient when they start asking you stuff and want a lot of data. That doesn't mean that they're unhappy with you or they don't believe what you're saying. That's just how they function. So when you're connecting with others, keep generational differences in mind. I think that's so important that when we do that, we might understand more quickly why that person's looking at us like we're crazy. And use things like the DISC behavioral style profile to connect with everyone, every generation, everyone, kind of levels the playing field, if you will. So you can attend a DISC virtual or live workshop. I usually do them live. Right now they're all virtual, but I do those quite often. And usually in a workshop, I'm talking 6 to 8 people on a virtual call, so there's lots of interaction. And along with that, you get the DISC assessment, which when you get it from John Maxwell, it's a little more expensive because you get a 30-page report that really helps you fine-tune your view. There's 3 graphs that describe how you look at the world, and then how others will respond to that and how you can interact with them. Everything from communication to leadership. And we've even used it with families. It's just a great tool. So if any of you are interested in a 2-part workshop that includes the assessment, today you can sign up for it for $75. And I apologize, my website's fairly new and I don't have my cash register going yet. So if you want to just send me an email, that would be great. I'm getting there. It just takes a little time. And I also have a new ebook coming out on my website. It should be out by October 9. So it's free. Go download it if you're interested. It's a little bit of everything about communicating. And any more information that you need, you can go to my website or contact me in any of these ways. And I just appreciate you taking time to hear my message today, and I'd love to hear any questions that you have.
Awesome. Thanks, Shawn. Let's see. Randy, go ahead.
Without naming names, there's somebody who's not here today that I personally have a good relationship with, and I think he or she would be very interested in the course, but he's not here today, so we can't sign up. Is there a way to accommodate that if indeed they are interested?
Yeah, if you don't mind sharing my contact information with him or them, just reference that. Say, sorry I missed the meeting. I'd like to sign up.
Well, and just in a general, this will be up in a recording, so some people will engage with your talk post meeting.
Right.
And so if there's a time limit or whatever, I just encourage you to extend it enough to where maybe first part of next week people can have a chance, because you will get some engagement post meeting from people that weren't on the
Yeah, I'm going to reach out to them today, right after this call, and suggest he watch the video and think about it, because we've just had a conversation about not this exact topic, but some of the things involved in this topic.
Right.
Yeah, I would love that. I will be very flexible. So if they want to just refer to this call or this talk, I'll be happy to extend that. It's a great time to do things like that. Since we're virtual, most of us have some time to learn new things. And I think that's one of the upsides to what's going on in our world right now.
That's good.
Shawn, I'd like to say I really enjoyed today. And I can relate to all of that. As I posted in the chat, I've taken several personality classes, and that helped me work with my clients, because I work with seniors all the way in their 80s selling homes, millennials, baby boomers, Gen Z. It'll be interesting to see the Gen X and how that transpires. My daughters are millennials in their mid-30s. So I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate it. I have to jot out, but I just wanted to say that. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go on and take a look at your website.
Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate that.
All right, Mako?
Yeah, I just have a general observation. I think all of us at our age and stuff have a sense of urgency, and I guess an obligation to be aware of all the things that you pointed out in your presentation. But from my perspective, I wish that the younger guys or younger folks had this knowledge too, to be able to communicate with us older guys also. Because it seems like I knew when I was growing up as a kid, my parents, they don't know anything. But now as an adult and an older adult, I really value all the lessons that I learned back then. But I didn't realize it then, but now I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's we all grew through that, but that whole journey of learn or believing that our parents didn't know anything.
Great talk, Shawn. And I can just when you put up the DISC little thing that shows the 4 quadrants and everything, I took DISC and I took situational leadership. And when you were done with the course, they gave you this glossy credit card kind of a thing, just with the information and the graphic on both sides. And I carried those around for years. Somewhere along the way, I lost the DISC card, but I still have the situational leadership one. And they really do kind of go hand in hand. The personality style and the situation are really important to understand, both yours and the people you're working with. So thank you
Yeah.
very much. It was
You're
very
welcome.
easy on the eyes. It was very easy to understand and follow. Good quality slides and not too much stuff. So I kept up with you.
Good, good.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy. Lloyd, did you have something or did you change your mind?
I just wanted to say thank you. That was very interesting. Gave me a little bit more insight to this whole disc thing because disc has been, uh, I don't know, one of those mind blown things for me. I'm not very visual. I'm not intuitive. So just looking at disc and all that stuff. I actually took a disc test and I read the report and I still didn't know what I was.
Well, one of the things actually when I was in corporate, when we were doing large multi-billion-dollar deals, we actually did assessment. It was a version of DISC, but it was a four quadrants and whatever, and we actually identified where each of us fit. And the reality of it is, as you get older, you adapt. So really, it's only under stress and those kinds of things where your kind of basic grounding you go back to. And so when people get, depending on what they're doing, but it's very interesting. And we used to not only assess all the members of our team, we had large teams pursuing these multi-billion-dollar deals, but we'd also assess all the people in the client side because it wasn't a buyer, it was a buyer's table. And we would assess them and we would align members of the team with people that weren't diagonal, if you understand that
Yeah.
the use of DISC. If they're diagonal, then there's less likelihood that you're going to easily find common ground just because of the way you process. So it's very fascinating. It's actually a very, very good tool to use if you haven't. It's not just about knowing what you are. It's basically then knowing not only what you are, but how other people are and how you can approach. I'm an ID really.
Yeah,
I'm a
that's what
high,
I am.
I'm a high energy, more I than D, but I'm kind of
Mhm.
like in the middle. And yeah, and I'm an extrovert as well. You guys know that.
Yeah.
So
It's
It can
again,
interesting
even,
to
check
hear
in
you
on
say
your
that,
extroverts, by the way, because
David,
extroverts
because
are coming.
I was just going to say that I'm a D. I was a D
uh-huh,
uh, when I first started out, in work, and I thought I knew it all. And you can
yeah.
imagine all this. People who know me, so I was very dominant. But fortunately, I had some really good mentors and
Mhm.
bosses, and I gradually, with help, moved more.
Mhm,
Realized I had to move towards an influencer
Yeah.
mhm.
because I was mostly in business development and sales. And you can't make people
No,
buy. You have to influence their
yeah.
decisions.
Right.
So
And you
this really
evolved.
struck some personal chords with me. It was really
Yeah.
good.
Well, we talk about, so when we do the workshop, we talk about EQ and how it works with the disc. So like both of you were alluding to that as you get older, you adjust a little bit because you become aware that like being a high D is obnoxious sometimes. And and but EQ plays a part in that too. So as you understand your type and what your weaknesses are in areas you can improve in, it kind of fits in with EQ and just becoming more emotionally healthy.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's a
some of us would
thing.
like to call it obtaining wisdom.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
We didn't used to have EQ. That's a 90s term. So we had to learn EQ before it was a thing, right?
Well, we can continue to do this, but let's give Shawn a hand and thank you, Shawn. It was awesome. Appreciate it. And let me just do a quick announcement. We have